What first drew you to studying rituals? Like, what was interesting about them and what merited study?
Yeah, so I grew up in Greece, and I've always been fascinated by ritual. And one reason I was fascinated by it is that to me it didn't make sense. The kinds of rituals that they would have me go through at the time, through the schooling system, for example,
Yeah.
they were forced upon me.
Such as?
Such as morning prayer at school, which is something Greek schools did and I think still do to this day. And at the same time, I grew up reading National Geographic magazine. This was the time just before the internet became widely available. We didn't have, there was no cable television in Greece during those years. So some of my heroes were people like Jane Goodall and David Attenborough, through the BBC documentaries, and Jacques Cousteau, if these names ring a bell to our younger members of the audience. But these were people who were going out there exploring the world, and they were combining an experiential perspective with science. So those were the types of heroes that I had growing up. But at the same time, reading those pages of National Geographic or looking at those documentaries, it felt to me that these things were distinct. They were not the same as what I was doing at school. They were not the same as people were doing around me. They felt like they were removed in time and in space, like relics of the past. And I remember the moment where I was watching this.
Can you give me an example of something that felt like a relic from the past?
Initiation rituals in Africa or in Amazonia. High-intensity rituals, because the ones I was exposed to in my small bubble as a child were very different, and they didn't feel very exciting to me.
Yeah.
So there was this news story about a small village not very far from Thessaloniki, where I grew up, where people, Orthodox Christians in that particular village, engage in fire-walking rituals. Once every year, they build a big fire and they spread the coals, and they walk barefooted on burning embers. And that was fascinating to me. So I asked my grandfather. He was the most religious person I knew. And I said, do you know about this ritual? And he said, of course I know about this ritual. And in fact, there's other kinds of high-intensity rituals in Greece. There are these pilgrimages where people crawl on hands and knees in order to go and visit a miracle-working icon in the island of Tinos. And that was a big realization for me, that those types of behaviors, those rituals, they're not relics of the past. They might seem bizarre to outsiders, but all human cultures have things that outsiders will look at and they would find bizarre. That's where my fascination with ritual started, and I wanted to become an anthropologist, and I did that. And I did what anthropologists do. So in fact, I went back to that village and I studied those fire-walking rituals for my PhD. But at the end of that trajectory, I felt that I was still missing something. I spent 16 months talking to people, as anthropologists do. I got their perspective. I brought in my own interpretation of what they were doing. But I felt that I was missing a piece of the puzzle, precisely because of those heroes that I grew up with. I felt I was missing a scientific perspective on that. So then I turned towards cognitive science, and I started doing what I call bringing the lab into the field, which is different than what most anthropologists do. So my approach has been to bring scientific measurement in the field in order to test some of the claims that our informants, our participants make, and some of the claims that anthropologists make. Can we actually measure some of the outcomes of those rituals? So that's my trajectory.
What are the findings? Like, what sorts of things do you measure?
One approach that I have followed was to take something interesting that my participants say and see if I can turn that into my hypothesis. One example of this is that when I was studying these high-intensity rituals, fire-walking in Greece and later in Spain, and more recently on the island of Mauritius, where people pierce their bodies with hooks and needles and skewers, they will say things like, when we're there and we're performing this, there might be thousands of people, but we feel like one. They talk about this sense of togetherness. In some rituals, in an Islamic Sufi ritual in Turkey, people told me that they feel as if their hearts beat as one. And I thought, okay, this is something we can actually measure, heart rates. So I started discussions with people in neuroscience and even in physics and on how to measure things and in psychology. And we brought a team together and went to Spain and measured fire-walking. In the context of a fire-walking ritual, we measured people's heart rates. And we found that as they engaged in this ritual, their heart rates were beginning to synchronize.
Oh, like it literally happened?
Literally synchronize. And not just the firewalkers, but even the firewalkers and those who were just watching them on some terraces, much like this. This is a context where it's a village of 600 people, and 3,000 people flock together on that day, on the summer solstice, to watch this firewalking ritual. And participants will take off their shoes and carry somebody on their back and walk on burning embers that we measured at 1200 Fahrenheit, over 700 Celsius. This is enough to melt aluminum. And people walk on that surface. So we found that their heart rates and those of their loved ones were watching, but not those of the foreigner, the curious tourists, were synchronizing. And that got me thinking about other phenomena. For example, when
Hold on. I'm so fixated. This is just blowing my mind because not only is it interesting that it's synchronized, but what's really fascinating to me was that they described it that way. And presumably they've been describing it that way for generations before we even knew about, biological functions like a certain heart rate. Tell me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So ritual is something we do. It comes very viscerally to us. It comes intuitively to us. We perform it, and we know at some level that it has some functions for us. Another example is when people tell me that rituals help them soothe their anxiety. And that's something that anthropologists have mentioned for 100 years. Bronislaw Malinowski famously noticed that the people he was studying, fishermen in the Trobriand Islands in Melanesia, they would perform a lot of rituals before going out to fish in the deep sea, which was very risky business and uncertain. But before fishing in the safe waters of the lagoon, there were no rituals. So he proposed over 100 years ago that rituals serve this function, alleviating anxiety. And people again and again tell me that. So again, with my collaborators, we investigated this and we measured people's physiological reactions. We also measured how they feel. And we see that those things were in accordance. So after performing rituals, people feel calmer, but we can detect this. We can see that their heart rate variability goes up, which is a good thing. Their electrodermal activity goes down, which is again a good thing. Their cortisol levels are reduced. Again, all of these things are in accordance with what they feel and point to the fact that they work in alleviating anxiety.
Do societies become dependent on rituals in a potentially unhealthy way?
I refer to ritual in my book as a social technology. And as any technology, it has the capacity to be used for better and for worse. So when I talk about these high-intensity rituals, for example, there's this notion that an anthropologist called Emil Durkheim came up with, called collective effervescence. And this refers to the bubbling up of emotions. Like if you've ever been in a football stadium and chanted together with 30,000 people, or if you're a member of a concert or a big demonstration and you felt goosebumps at the back of your neck when being part of a massive crowd, that's collective effervescence. And this is something that I have felt personally, going in a stadium in my hometown, which I always do when I have the chance to do now that I don't live in Greece. I still get goosebumps at the back of my neck when I chant with 30,000 people. But I cannot leave out the fact that people who took part in, let's say, Nazi parades would have felt the same thing. So again, ritual can be used for better and for worse. At the personal level too, ritual can sometimes get out of hand. We see this because it's connected to conditions like OCD, obsessive compulsive behavior.
So that's more what I was curious about. Obviously, like Nazi parties, not historically not a great thing.
We can agree.
Yes, a very controversial opinion, I know. But yeah, let's talk about the OCD aspect of it. Like when you get so accustomed to a certain ritual on an individual level, and for some reason you're not able to perform that ritual, what happens?
So there are different theories of that, and there's one perspective that says that rituals are just a mental glitch, and OCD is just one manifestation of that. Ritual doesn't serve any adaptive purpose, and sometimes it can run wild. There's another perspective that says that ritual is part of our evolutionary heritage. I mean, you see throughout the animal kingdom, you see that as our ancestors have become more discernibly human, they have much more rituals. So it does serve adaptive functions. But in the case of OCD, what happens is that the mind does not get the feedback that the ritual has been performed, and therefore now we can ease our anxiety.
So it's undone. Yeah. Interesting. So what's the difference then between a ritual and a routine?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. One way to put this is that rituals, by definition, are non-utilitarian actions.
Okay.
Routines are just something that we do regularly.
That means that they functionally don't serve a purpose.
Correct.
But they're done.
Yes.
Okay.
And there's routinization in ritual, but a routine can be anything. It can be brushing your teeth in the morning.
Yeah.
Now, it has a very clear purpose and a very clear outcome. If I wake up every morning and I just dance around in front of the mirror, now that's clearly a ritual. And the other aspect of ritual, it has this feeling of specialness and sometimes sacredness. So if our routines get interrupted, we might be disturbed, but we will be disturbed at a different level. If our rituals get interrupted, and there's psychological research showing that, people get morally upset about that.
Interesting. Okay. So tell me a little bit more about the effect that rituals have. You're talking about the goosebumps on the back of your neck. How did this evolutionarily happen? What has your research told you about the effects of rituals?
Right, so if we look at the history of ritual, we'll see that it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Going all the way back to species that are very far removed from us phylogenetically, species like birds, for example. That's one of the most typical examples of ritualization. Ethologists talk about ritualized behaviors there, which are things that used to have a function and then become stylized and serve a secondary function. So, for example, in courtship rituals, there might be behaviors that resemble feeding or grooming or all kinds of things, but now they acquire a different kind of function. In human rituals, you see that dancing, which is, in my opinion, the quintessential ritual, like what's the purpose of dancing other than to make us feel good? But it also has clear functions. It contributes to social bonding. If you see dancing, it looks like a choreographed battle of sorts sometimes, or one of those courtship rituals that you find in other.
And it's not a surprise that in Brazil, for example, there is dance fighting.
Yeah, absolutely,
So
in many cultures.
You're talking about combat here.
Yes, so this has historically been a way among many cultures to resolve conflicts in symbolic ways, in having things like song duels or all kinds of ritualized displays without actually resorting to violence.
Yeah, a dance-off.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What have you noticed about current day? What do you think about current day rituals, perhaps even rituals that you see online, like digital rituals, if you want to call them that?
Digital rituals, that's a very timely topic. The fundamental aspect of ritual is action, right? So symbolism is part of it, but a ritual is enacted. It is an embodied act. And we learned this very well during the pandemic. We found that when we tried to move our rituals online, it served a purpose at the time because there has never been a time in one generation where people had a greater need to reduce their anxiety. And there was never a time where people needed more human connection. And they couldn't find it. They lost one of the main tools that we have, cultural tools that we have to deal with this, which is ritual. So what we saw is that first of all, people started adapting their traditional rituals. We saw things like virtual funerals and virtual drive-in and drive-through birthdays and virtual graduations. And immediately we all felt that this is not exactly the same.
Yes.
We also saw that people sometimes defied the lockdowns. They risked their
That's what I wanted to
lives.
ask you about. When you think about, like, there were virtual concerts as well. Is it possible in that space for everyone's heart to beat as one, to get those goosebumps on the back of your neck? I guess it also depends on, like, the quality of the sound system you're listening to, because it's different in a stadium versus, you know, shitty laptop speakers.
So I think that currently this is definitely not the same. And in fact, we have data that shows this. We've done research in the context of sports, for example, where I would argue that team loyalty and the experience of sports fanship goes through those ritualized interactions that take place in the terraces, not what happens in the pitch. So we did this paper that was published during COVID, where we compared basketball fans. We measured their physiological responses for an entire season as they were going to watch basketball games in the United States, and compared them to groups that were watching them on television as groups. And what we find is that when we look at any kind of structural aspect of these sports, how fast they are, who's winning, who is playing, by far, the thing that made the biggest difference was whether you were physically present in the stadium. It wasn't about what's happening in the pitch.
Yeah.
And that we saw that there was more emotional synchrony in the stadium, but also that predicted both people's experience. So they found these experiences more meaningful when they were physically present. And that predicted their social bonding, how bonded they felt to other fans. I mean, there's a reason we're all here physically, and I'm not having this discussion online with you.
Oh my God, we did Brain Bar virtually in 2020, and it was so alienating and awkward.
That is exactly the point. So if a futurist from the past would probably have predicted that when the technology allowed you to do it online, that would be the best, the most popular event you ever had.
Yeah.
But of course, because we're humans, we know very well that this was probably the worst event you had because
And
you
also,
missed
I'm
the
extremely
personal
needy,
connection.
you know? I'm a comedian, so I need like that feedback. Seeing someone type lol in the comment section does nothing for me.
Yes, and that's also an important point. So we talked about synchrony, and the way we synchronize with other people is we constantly look for cues. We look at each other's faces. We synchronize our body movements. There are studies that show that when we feel rapport, when we like each other more, immediately we begin in unconscious ways to mimic their body movements, their mannerisms. And that's how this synchrony snowballs. And that's something you cannot have in the digital age. Not today, in any case. Maybe not some distant future where we have fully immersive technology that has tactile components and allows you to feel each other's presence physically. Maybe then we can talk about online rituals.
Well, what about when people feel like they're part of a thriving and real and, you know, they feel emotionally connected to an online community where we talk, you know, like a subscriber base to a certain blog or, you know, couples going Instagram official or something like that. Are these new digital rituals or is it just a shiny title we're giving?
There's no doubt that there's space for this, and there's a lot of value to the virtual world, especially in cases where you have people who might be disabled or who are separated by great distances. I mean, I live on a different continent than my family, so it's very important to me. And during COVID, we had virtual rituals with my family. We celebrated holidays together. But they're just not the same thing because they're missing this fundamentally human aspect of interpersonal connection and interaction that is fundamentally physically based.
Are we moving in a direction that's getting rid of more traditional rituals and inventing new ones, or are we just having fewer rituals in our lives? What's the deal?
The way I see it is that we don't have fewer rituals in our lives. The human need for ritual is ancient and it's constant. What we're seeing is that in parts of the world that are becoming more secular, as people are moving away from more established, more traditional forms of ritual, they're turning towards new ones. And I can see that in the form of New Age movements, neo-pagan movements, or all kinds of spiritual movements that take inspiration from the East, perhaps, in Western contexts, or in secular, ritualized interactions, like what happens in concerts and sports stadiums and so on and so forth. So our life is as ritualized today as it has always been, and we only need to look at the public domain to confirm that. So our courtrooms are just as ritualized, and our parliaments are just as ritualized. Our universities...
standing when the judge walks in, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, okay. That makes sense. All right, we live in an age of a lot of distraction. We've heard a lot of the speakers during this festival talk about distraction or diminishing attention spans. Are rituals a way to combat that, or are the two just unrelated?
This is a great point. When we look at the individual level functions of rituals, one of them is related to goal regulation. So we are used to thinking that we act because we believe or because we hold attitudes, but a lot of what we do actually goes the other way. So first we act, and then that shapes our personality. And one way in which ritual can do this is that it can make us more mindful, it can make us more disciplined. So there's a reason why almost all religious traditions have had fasting periods.
Yeah.
This gives a signal to the self. So if I can do this, then I am a disciplined individual. That's similar to, let's say, in the military, where you have to make your bed every morning. What's the purpose of that? You're going to mess it up anyway.
Yeah, but
right?
there's a difference between discipline and deprivation. So discipline is doing the quote-unquote right thing when it doesn't have a physiological change to you. But something like fasting, it creates this need, this desire, it's sort of weakening yourself for a greater message. Or
this actually brings me to another point, that when it comes to ritual, cost is not a bug, it's a feature.
Yeah.
And by cost, it can be many things. Some of the rituals that I've studied for my research involve bodily costs. People walk on fire, they suffer, they hurt. They can be financial costs, they can be investments of time. If you go to church every Sunday across a lifespan, that's a few years of your time spent in rituals. And there's plenty of psychological research showing that the costlier the ritual, the better it functions both to change your personality, so to have these effects, let's say on personal discipline, but also its bonding effects are amplified. Because now you can signal to the community that you're taking this seriously. And at the end of the day, that's also the basic logic behind an initiation ceremony. So you have to show me that you're serious about taking place in this, being part of this community.
I accept that, but you're talking about once you've reached the age of reason. What if these costs are made when you're still an infant? I'm talking about like circumcision, for example.
Right. So the signaling.
How are you able to lock into a society?
From an evolutionary perspective, the answer is the same here. So you're still assuming costs, whether on yourself or your offspring, which is the same for your reproductive potential, right? And those costs allow you to signal to the community that you're a committed member. And that works for religious groups, that works for secular groups. That's why in the military, you see that the more elite the group is, like the Navy SEALs, for example, the tougher their rituals. This is the logic behind fraternity initiations,
hazing rituals,
gang initiations. Like yes.
So I guess cost can also be emotional. Like there's a humiliation factor in some of these initiation rituals, especially when you're talking about gang initiations and fraternity initiations.
Absolutely. And one of the most interesting things that we're finding is that these emotional costs can actually be contagious. So we've done research in the context of a Hindu pilgrimage in Mauritius, and we use GPS to track people's movement, and we also measured their physiological responses, their emotional responses, and we see that these emotions spread like wildfire through the procession. This is something that, as an anthropologist, I can see with my eyes. When a person begins to swirl and appear to fall into trance, the next person is more likely to do that, but now have the data to describe it. And we've also done this in the context of less intense rituals in Islamic ceremonies, for example. Again, we see that these emotions spread from person to person to person. And in fact, in the context of these very painful rituals that I study, they can extend to those who suffer vicariously, just because they see their loved ones suffering. They don't even suffer themselves physically.
Now, let's also look at it from a cultural perspective, because are national holidays examples of rituals?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm not Hungarian, but I obviously participate in the national holidays. You know, I take the days off. I eat the lentils at New Year's and all that kind of stuff. What does that do for an immigrant?
So that gives you a sense of belonging, and that's at the social level. That's ultimately what ritual does. One way in which I phrased it is that it gives you a sense of being part of something as greater than yourself. Our identity consists of multiple components. You know, you have the individual aspects of your identity. You might be a comedian or an anthropologist, or you might be a father. But then you're also a member of all of these groups. You might be a Catholic, you might be a Hungarian, you might be any number of things, right? And that collective identity comes through sharing in not just norms, but sharing in actions and symbols and physically enacting that group membership. It gives you that kind of sense that also extends beyond place and time. So when you perform a ritual, you feel like people have done this before you, and they will do this after you. So you're a member of this uninterrupted line.
Is that then put under threat, like the more, I'm talking about plurality here. So if you participate in rituals that are specific to one group, as well as another group, as well as another group, does the strength of your bond with one group then get diluted with the more groups you perform rituals with?
This is something I think about a lot, given how the world is changing right now. And I think that in my field site, Mauritius, a small island in the Indian Ocean, is a good example of this. So in the literature, Mauritius is usually portrayed as a successful example of peaceful coexistence between different ethnic and religious groups. It's one of the most diverse societies in the world. And this happens for many reasons, but one of those reasons is that the state has chosen to celebrate the main religious festivals of all of those groups. And in fact, you see that people take part in each other's rituals. And we have looked at people, how the people feel after those rituals. And we find that after taking part in some of the, let's say, the main Hindu rituals, they feel more Mauritian as a whole. They don't stress their Hindu identity.
Oh, okay.
Also because of the fact that in those same rituals, you see Christians taking part. Sometimes you see Muslims taking part. So they take part in each other's rituals. So they maintain that sense of smaller group identity, but they also keep that overarching national identity. And I think it can be done, but of course, it takes a lot.
And there's a lot of politics and feelings involved, yeah. All right, well, that concludes our time. This has been really fascinating.
Thank you so much.
I'm looking forward to digging into this and thinking about it a lot more as well. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for Dimitris. Oh, no, we have a question. Awesome, we have a question. Yeah, let's get him a microphone. He has one.
Would you consider addictions, for example, smoking, as rituals?
Or routines?
I had a similar question earlier. Right? So I wouldn't call that a ritual because there is a direct goal. When you're smoking, you're seeking immediate reward. I would call it a routine. But the question I got this morning actually was whether you can break those addictions. And I think ritual can become very useful here. So a very common way of breaking one bad habit, bad routine, is by adopting a beneficial one. So, and many smokers mention this. When they give up smoking, they just need something else to do. Maybe they chew gum or they take a fidget spinner or something like that. And I think ritual can be a very good substitute here because it's more than a routine. It brings the routinization, the repetition aspect, the structural aspect, but it also brings a layer of meaning. So maybe engaging in something like meditation or yoga. And I'm not going to say what that should be. It's whatever works for you. But the best way to break one bad habit might be to take up on a beneficial one.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Yes, we have one more, and then last one. I'm sorry, we're really out of time.
Do you think there is place in the future for harmful rituals, such as like body transformation, or you talked about like stepping on hot stuff?
If there's place in the future? Oh, you mean whether we should abandon those rituals? So if you look at the anthropological record, and if you look at the kinds of extreme rituals that I study, they're of two kinds. There's the kind that is imposed on young children without their consent, things like circumcision or bodily mutilation. Some of these are horrible, and I think there shouldn't be place for those in any society. But I've been lucky enough to not have to witness that. So all of the rituals that I studied are imposed upon the self, and in fact, you will see that people not only don't see them as detrimental, they derive meaning from them. And in fact, we have done studies that we see that the more they suffer voluntarily, the greater their well-being, their subjective well-being is a few months later. So as long as this is consensual, I would say whatever is useful in creating meaning for you, go ahead and do it.
Don't you think there is pressure on the individual in small societies to precipitate in these activities?
That is true, and it can be very hard to draw that line. But you can make this claim about so many of the things we do, right? We are fundamentally social. We're hyper-social beings. So much of what we do, from what we choose to study to what we choose to do with our free time or the rituals we choose to take part in, is partly peer pressure. So that's a very big discussion. It's a fair point, and there's no perfect answer. The line is very hard to find. It's a very blurry one.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question. Big round of applause for Dimitris Xygalatas.
Thank you.